Here we are again in week 4, looking at the second lesson of the two-part series. And what we're here to do is to continue talking about managing in the global environment. So I'm going to share the screen with you, and we're going to have a look at what I have in store. First up, you recognize that little diagram. We spoke in the first lesson of this week about managers having to look after their business, the business that employs them, in the context of the immediate task environment within which their firms operate, as well as the broader remote environment within which their firm is operating. So if we look today, in the last lesson, remember we looked at the task environment. In this lesson, now today, we're going to be looking at the more general forces in that broader green donut that you see. So first up, the E of pest forces are economic forces, as you see written on that page. The T in pest forces is about technology and what technology does for the firm. Now, an interesting example is the fact that this recording is available to you on YouTube, but it's produced using Zoom with one participant, and that's myself. Now, Zoom is an astonishing success story, but their fortunes were always going to change once people went back to work. And that's what this particular article, I think this is November 2022, in a Reuters article, as a press association. And this is the most interesting graph, because what it demonstrates for you is the fact that although 2020 saw those massive peaks with incredible growth in sales revenue, that diminished very dramatically, which means that Zoom has to think about how to reinvent itself, because if Zoom's managers are unable to reinvent the firm, it's going to be like a one-trick wonder back in 2020 and nothing much else besides, kind of like Vanilla Ice, not so. So the S in pest forces are the sociocultural forces. And as I report this to you, I can tell you that at the Kennedy Road settlement, the municipal dump wall has just been breached. And as a consequence, because the protesters would like to set fire to the dump, there's a very real risk that there's going to be the most almighty methane gas explosion, because that's where methane gas lines run. So this is just one protest, and there's been about 3 days of it now here in Durban, Quarry Road and Kennedy Road. About 15,000 community protests every year. And in fact, starting Tuesday last week, we had the SRC establish a protest on the university campus, which is why you and I no longer see each other in the classroom. It's a pattern of the country, and way back in the 1980s, we had international firms place an enormous amount of pressure on South African businesses, and those boycotts saw many international firms leave their operations in South Africa, and that placed enough pressure on the South African government, which was then frozen out of the world market, to contemplate doing what people have been asking for a long time, which is to establish a more sensible social system. And what we have is another social system. I don't know that it's more sensible. It appears in many respects, almost 30 years on, to be as unsensible as the last one, but time will tell. The social structures that creates, or that old environment created, and the new social stratification, which has been established since the mid-1990s, means that there's always been a demarcation between rich and poor, people who have and people who don't have. And here's the funny thing. There are some countries of the world where this doesn't take place. So in Sweden, for example, there's not much difference between rich and poor. And that is something which then gives rise to what we refer to as national cultures, or the the S in pest is a socio-cultural environment which is distinctive in different places. And that means that when you're operating a business in a jurisdiction which is different from yours, you have to be aware and account for those differences. Because if you don't, you do that at the peril of the firm's sustainability. Now, at the question that I pose to you here, when your textbook says that individualism is highly valued in the United States, whereas in Korea and Japan, individuals are expected to conform, I'm going to say, what is the story here in South Africa? What is the national culture here? Because the basis upon which cultures are compared and contrasted is something that was introduced to us many years ago by a gentleman by the name of Gert Hofstede. And as an academic, he introduced his model of national culture. And I challenge you to Google Hofstede's model of national culture. He eventually established a business, which his son, also Gert Jr., runs. And what Hofstede Sr., who was a psychologist for IBM, as it turns out, because of his access to the IBM employees, he collected, I think it was in excess of 100,000 data points from 100,000 IBM employees. And what he did was, as a psychologist, survey the nature of their thinking and feelings, their values, their attitudes, the lessons of week 3. And he found that there were these two broad characteristics of individualism and collectivism, and what he called power distance. And power distance is the relationship, if you like, between the haves and the have-nots, and sometimes there's an enormous amount of power distance in national jurisdictions, which is just par for the course in those jurisdictions, and sometimes there isn't. So in Sweden, for example, and Denmark, and in fact all of the Nordic countries, there isn't much power difference at all, whereas in China, and certainly South Africa and every other authoritarian or autocratic environment, there is an enormous power distance. Now, that's just some of the distinction we draw, because achievement orientation and this notion of a nurturing orientation and what Hofstede called an uncertainty avoidance, and he then established that some societies had low uncertainty avoidance and others had a very high uncertainty avoidance, with an expectation of conformity. And in other words, don't rock the boat culture would be a high uncertainty avoidance society. He was also able to contrast this with the view taken by people, whether they looked to the long term or whether they wanted immediate gratification. You understand that in South Africa, just the pressure to stay alive means that we have a very, very short-term orientation. In other words, you think for today, and tomorrow you'll think about when you finally get to tomorrow. You're not going to worry about it too much today. So it's possible for you to actually go and look at this stuff, because if you go to this particular web page, you can start comparing and contrasting countries, and it's quite a bit of fun, because what you're doing is effectively just manipulating the data in their database, and they've given you the opportunity to do it, so you can draw different reports. So I've done a sample for you. There's South Africa, so it's measured on an index of 1 to 100, and and what you see is South Africa rating fairly high on power distance, fairly high on individualism. We've always maintained we have a fairly toxic masculine culture in the country, and certainty avoidance is quite high, but our long-term orientation is quite low, and our indulgence is quite high. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that describes the population of South Africa, and I'm going to tell you that you'd be entirely wrong, because that data is primarily from white South Africans, of which there are very few in South Africa relative to the overall population. The overall population has not, in fact, been polled. So we don't have a clear idea of South Africa. And I think it might be then safer to do for you a different comparison with countries which have data which is more representative. So I selected for you 3: Argentina, which I think is about fiery hotheads, and China, which I think is very autocratic and oppressive, and Sweden, which is not hotheads and not fiery and not oppressive. And you can compare them then on power distance and individualism and masculinity. Now look at the score for Sweden in masculinity. Only 5 points out of 100 on that particular index, relative, for example, to the others where China and Argentina rate very, very high. The uncertainty avoidance in Argentina, very high. And some surprisingly, both China and Sweden are quite tolerant of uncertainty. Very little long-term orientation in Argentina, and a very high long-term orientation in China. They're playing the long game, and they play the long game because they're not indulgent. And I have something coming up for you which you'll find quite surprising. Let's move on and get to that point. This is how power distance works in China. Very high youth unemployment. It's about 20% here in August 2023, which compares to youth unemployment in South Africa of a figure north of 60, 70%. It's very, very high, and a general broad unemployment rate of in excess of 45%. But there's a lot of youth unemployment in this country. Now, the distinction, however, and here's an example of Gloria Lee. So Ms. Lee graduated in June with a master's degree in graphic design, and she started looking last fall, which means last autumn, hoping to find an entry-level position that pays about $1,000 a month. So a master's graduate is looking for an entry-level position. But she's only been offered internships that pay about $200 to $300 a month with absolutely no benefits attached to that with her master's degree. Remember, I told you that it was very competitive and that you had to get your head around that. That's what I'm talking about. So in May this year, she messaged more than 200 recruiters, sent her CV to 32 companies, got 2 interviews. I think it's quite good. And she said she'd take any offer, including a sales offer. So in her interview, she said, even though a decade or so ago, China was so full of opportunities, where I am now is I have no idea where to turn. But it's only 20% youth unemployment compared to something which is almost 4 times the size of that in South Africa. Here's the kicker. The country's leader has said, stop thinking that you're above manual work. He's saying to the woman with the master's degree, stop thinking you're above working in the fields. And his view is they should learn to eat bitterness. Now, here's the thing, you see, in a country with a level of autocracy and authoritarianism as you have in China, if Ms. Lee and every other unemployed youth in China was to reject that and to protest against the state, they'd be terminated. If it was to happen in South Africa, oh, hang on a second, it is happening in South Africa, and no one's been terminated. It is such a broad distinction, and I hope that this has brought home that distinction, and you recognize it for what it is and how it impacts and how different it is across the world. So if we talking then about the general environment and we look at our young population, then we must contemplate what that means, because you see, if we have a lot of unemployed youth and we have a lot of people in the education industry who will near retirement in the next 10 years and then retire, we have to say, how much money are we putting into the country's tax coffers that is going to pay for the medical care for youth who are unemployed. And what we recognize is that South Africa is going to find itself in a decidedly unpleasant position if it is unable to generate the kind of store of wealth or reserve of wealth which will be necessary to provide benefits to the community. While we do talk about something referred to as the demographic dividend, or in other words, this great big bubble, this explosion of labor availability, we're not able to take advantage of it. We're unable to exploit it. And there are too many people who have no competency to provide service in a modern economy. And that's something that we have to give a lot of time and attention to, I think. So that's the part of the S in pest, and I want to talk to you about finally the P in pest, because the P in pest is about the nature of laws which impact on how you can do business. So we have a motor industry development program in this country, which means that anyone who sells cars here gets to be able to import more cars if they make cars in this country. So Ford, for example, make Rangers in this country, and Isuzu make Isuzu D-Max bakkies in this country, and in Toyota Prospecton we make lots of Toyotas, and in BMW Pretoria or Roslyn we make lots of BMWs. That means that those companies can import a lot of cars. Now, there is a move by the Chinese government, for example, to establish significant investment in motor industry manufacturing here, and the investment has been made, just hasn't been spent yet. So the intention is that down in the Eastern Cape, Gqeberha side, that what we will have is a hub where there is already a lot of motor manufacture. We're going to be seeing more of it, and it'll be for bake cars, or effectively cars made under the auspices of the Chinese government. And when that happens, we can see, or expect to see, the prices of Chinese cars like Chery and Haval and GWM and Bake fall even further than the low price point, relatively low price point at which they are now. And that is going to give a decided competitive advantage to those firms which are already selling a lot of Chinese cars in this country on the basis of them being, I think, very good value for money. So this is part and parcel of what we refer to as globalization. The distance between ourselves in South Africa and every other country in the world is actually quite limited. So it's surprising to find a large South African business that does not export to the rest of the world, and which does not import from the rest of the world, whether it's importing raw materials like fertilizer from Russia, or exporting things like citrus to Russia, or clothing to the United States, or importing equipment and mineral oil and whatever else from the rest of the world. Globalization means that we tend to be merging into one, but there will never be one. There's never going to be any global society which agrees with each other, because the world's population represents many distinctive national cultures. South Africa, just as an example, might be regarded as one nation, but it is made up of very many distinctive cultures, which is something which politicians have moved to emphasize. And that means that the population is usually at each other's throats, so many levels. You see, what globalization does is merge people in so many ways, but it also merges the way they do business with each other. So something which 30 or 40 and certainly 50 years ago was a very common way of distinguishing countries would be tariffs. And those tariffs were imposed in order to make it difficult to import cheaper goods, like chickens, for example, from other places. And other places would then respond by making it difficult for us to export goods to them. The Chinese some time ago made it easy for us to export our iron ore to them, and we then import the equipment which is made with the iron that they transform our iron ore into. We import that back from China. But the trouble here is that when you export iron ore, you can't get a lot of money for rocks. When you export coal, you can't get a lot of money for it. When you import equipment which has been produced using coal, which melts the iron ore, which produces the steel and iron, which is then used to produce the tooling and the equipment which we buy back, that becomes very expensive. So we're selling our coal cheaply, we're selling our iron ore cheaply, and we're buying expensive stuff which is made from it. And the point here is that we have a tariff structure, which in South Africa is a particularly confusing one. Because it's a confusing one, we don't see our way clear to operate as a competitive exporter. We're at the mercy, if you like, of more competitive nations. I heard it described not so long ago that negotiating with big countries in the Northern Hemisphere is like trying to balance in a boat that has an elephant in it. So you work out that expression and you'll see what that means. So distance and culture and changes in distance communication brought about by the internet have certainly altered the way we do business and altered trade barriers. I can think of a business now 10 kilometers away from me, which exports to the United States and which buys product from Thailand and from the United States and other jurisdictions in the world. And you can act on opportunity when it becomes available to you. Remember, I distinguish between opportunities and threats. You can act on opportunity and you can take steps to avoid the threats, provided you stay wide awake. So the difficult thing to read in that international context is simply how the values, and you understand values because it's what we spoke about last week. Values and norms differ in different jurisdictions. Our normative behavior as a nation is something which is documented, in fact, in our constitution. So there is in our constitution an enormous respect for human life and human rights. It might not manifest as such, but it is certainly documented as the norm. And we distinguish between the prescribed norms as they might appear in the Constitution and our legislation, and then just the social conventions. So, for example, it's probably unwise to go to an interview dressed in shorts because our conventions say you can if you want, but you're not going to create the right impression. And those social conventions of getting on with each other are perhaps, I think, what is currently being violated by the nature of the protests on campus, which have caused us all to retreat to our home offices and our residences, as the case may be, where we nurse what remains of the vestiges of an education system. Now, I have come to the end of the second lesson. I'm going to point out for you that these are the critical things that you learn from this, and that is that we distinguish between opportunities and threats, that it is essential for managers to be able to detect what the opportunities and threats are and to interpret the environmental signals so that there is a satisfactory response. And the response we want, literally, is just for the firms that managers run to take advantage of opportunities and to sidestep or avoid the threats where possible. If that doesn't happen, then and you don't have switched on managers, then the point is that things are going to go very, very badly for the firm. So look at those learning objectives and make sure you come to grips with the material. And the next time I see you in a lesson, we'll have moved on to the 5th week.